At minus 40 degrees in the high basins of the central Rockies, a cabin was not automatically a refuge. Sometimes it was a colder, more dangerous place than the forest outside. And on nights like this one, nights when the wind knifed down from the continental divide and the stars themselves seemed frozen in place, a poorly designed cabin became the deadliest trap a frontier traveler could walk into. Jonas Price learned that the hard way. He had built his cabin the previous autumn after hauling his supplies up a narrow mule trail that wound through Engelmann spruce and lodgepole pine. Locals had warned him about the winters in these high valleys. They told him the air could turn murderous. They told him the cold pooled like water. They told him to watch where he put the door and to think carefully about how the wind behaved. But Jonas had grown up in low-country hardwood forests, where a cabin was just 4 walls and a roof. He believed survival meant chopping enough wood and feeding the stove hot enough. He believed heat was something you fought for with muscle. That belief nearly killed him. On this night, Jonas snapped awake, unable to breathe. His blanket was stiff with frost. Not frost on top, frost from inside, frozen from his own exhaled breath. The interior walls glittered with ice crystals, his eyelashes stuck together. His breath plumed into the air and hung there, unmoving, as if even the air was too tired to rise. He reached a hand toward the lantern beside his bunk, and his fingers recoiled. Metal this cold bit back like an iron jaw. He fumbled with flint and steel, finally getting the lantern lit. The shaky glow revealed a terrifying truth. His fire, which he had fed only 3 hours earlier, was nearly dead. More shocking, its warmth had not filled the room. Instead, the cold had poured through the cabin seam so fast it swallowed every bit of heat. This wasn't just a cold cabin. This was a cabin designed to lose. Jonas could see the wind's fingerprints everywhere. Snowflakes drifted horizontal across the interior floorboards, slipping in through the wall gaps where he had stacked the logs too uniformly, too smoothly, without the irregular natural bite that made tighter seams. A near-invisible jet of cold air hissed around the doorframe. In the dark, he could see frost forming where the wind struck the opposing wall. The door faced east, up straight into the valley winds that accelerated like a funnel whenever storms rolled down from the divide. Jonas had built the door where it looked natural, not where wind physics said it should go. He swung his legs out of bed and felt the shock of the floor, a cold sink deeper than the air above it. His socks stiffened instantly. Somewhere in the rafters, the cabin groaned like an old, injured animal. The roof angle he had chosen, barely 20 degrees, was already sagging under the weight of wind-packed snow. He had meant for it to look neat, strong, symmetrical. Instead, it caught snow like a shovel blade, holding cold against the structure, pressing icy weight downward. His breath trembled as he knelt near the fire. He didn't understand why the logs burned so poorly. He didn't understand why no amount of wood kept the room warm. But a truth, when he didn't yet have words for, settled heavily on him. The cabin was not protecting him. The cabin was waging a quiet war against him. He fed the fire again, feeling panic rising. The flames licked up in the darkness, warming his hands only faintly. But as soon as heat rose, drafts stole it. It felt like pouring water into a sieve. He could feel air currents on his skin, tiny streams of minus 40-degree wind curling around his ankles, drifting across his arms, pulling heat away faster than he could create it. Jonas wrapped himself in his coat and stepped outside into the night to grab more firewood. The wind hit him like a blow, the raw cold flattening his lungs. He moved fast, understanding now that the space behind him, the 4 walls he had labored over and admired, was less a shelter and more a hollow, freezing chamber where cold slipped in and stayed. When he returned to the doorway, a moment of horror froze him in place. The warm air from his fire was streaming out of the top of his open door, flowing upward like a golden river in the lantern glow. He watched it drift out into the night and disappear. And then, equally horrifying, he saw the replacement, a rushing, nearly invisible current of cold air sweeping inward across the floor, racing toward the dying fire like a living thing. The cabin wasn't just poorly designed. It had become a kind of machine, a cold machine, built in exactly the wrong way, amplifying every weakness, punishing every mistake. He slammed the door shut, heart pounding. He didn't yet know the physics, but he could feel the consequences. A cabin built with the door facing the wind was a cabin built to fail. A roof angled too shallow was a roof that chilled itself. Uniformly peeled logs allowed drafts to carve through them like knives. A single large room meant heat dissipated too widely to matter. He sat down beside the fire, staring at the walls he had crafted with pride. He now saw only the fatal flaws. The cabin looked sturdy. It felt strong. But it was, in the brutal mathematics of a Rocky Mountain winter, a coffin shaped like a home. Jonas whispered into the dim lantern light, "Why is it colder in here than out there?" The answer hung in the frigid air, unspoken, because he had built it wrong, because the wind understood this valley better than he did, because the mountains did not forgive engineering mistakes. And as the fire cracked once more, weak, hungry, losing its battle, one thought pressed into Jonas's mind like a blade. What if the cabin was the real danger all along? If the storm lasted 2 more nights, this cabin would finish what the wilderness started. At -40 degrees, the truth was simple and brutal. A house with the wrong face to the wind could take a man's warmth and carry it away in an hour. In the winter of 1863, men who thought they had shelter found instead a machine that routed heat from hearth to sky. Most frontier cabins shared the same quiet design sins. Each choice, where to set the door, how steep to pitch the roof, whether to split the living space, looked small in daylight. But under the hard law of mountain winter, those small choices multiplied into mortal consequences. The first common error was orientation. Doors and primary openings placed on the windward side. Winds coming off ridgelines accelerate and stream down into valleys like water down channels. In a narrow basin, a 2 to 5 mile per hour hilltop wind can become a sustained 8 to 15 mile per hour downslope blast. When that airflow met a weak flange, a poorly fitted door, a simple vertical gap between logs, it produced a sustained pressure differential across the cabin shell. Warm interior air flowed out through high seams. Colder, denser air poured in along the floor. In tests reconstructed from contemporary accounts and modern wind tunnel analogs, a windward door reduced effective interior heat retention by roughly 30 to 45% compared with the same structure oriented leeward and protected by a vestibule. Second was single-room volume. Many settlers built one box, a single square or rectangle where stove, bed, workbench, and animals, when winter called for it, all crowded together. Heat in a single large volume dissipates rapidly. The physics is plain. Heat capacity of air is low. The larger the air volume, the more energy required to raise and sustain its temperature. A 12 by 14 single-room cabin holding 10 cubic meters more air will demand tens of kilograms more firewood each day to maintain survivable interior temperatures. Frontier hands could pile wood until dawn and still wake shivering if the room was simply too big and leaky. Roof geometry was the third silent killer. A shallow roof, say 15 to 20 degrees, chosen because it was easier to lay logs and look tidy, became a snow shoal. Snow that sticks to a shallow pitch compacts and freezes, forming an insulating but weighty mass that also traps cold and prevents the roof from radiating heat outward in a controlled fashion. Worse, where snow adhered instead of shedding, meltwater could refreeze its seams and pull nails and shakes loose. Contrast that with a steep 40 to 50 degree pitch. Snow slides off, loads are reduced, and the roof breathes. Early mountain carpenters who adopted steeper roofs found structure life improved and interior heat retention rose by measurable margins, often the difference between early season repair and midwinter catastrophe. Material choices and log preparation mattered as well. Logs that are uniformly hewn and smoothed can look neat, but the irregular natural profile of hand-peeled logs interlocks and seals better when stacked. Settlers who planned their timbers too smooth, seeking a neat, finished wall, introduced continuous seams where wind could shear through. The ideal, as indigenous builders well knew, was to leave bark pattern irregularities and to chink with moss, hair, or clay in layered fashion. When chinking was absent or thin, air velocities of only 2 to 3 miles per hour at the seam produced local heat transfer rates that reduced the effective output of a stove by 1 thermos. Another hidden error lay in smoke management and ventilation. Without a controlled smoke hole or a properly constructed flue, heat could escape unpredictably. A poorly drafted chimney will pull volatile warm air and its entrained heat upward like a vacuum. Worse, and tragically common, was the open gable or exposed rafter end, where every rising plume of smoke took a small fraction of the stove's heat with it and carried it straight outside. The valley siding choices compounded these design mistakes. Many men built in valley bottoms, simple to reach, sheltered by trees, and only later learned they had placed themselves in a cold sink. Cold air drains like water and pools in low points at night. Temperatures there can be 5 to 15 degrees lower than adjacent ridgelines. Build a cabin in that basin, and the whole structure starts the night surrounded by heavier, colder air. Combine a valley siding with a windward door, a shallow roof, and smooth logs, and the result is predictable. Those physical truths explain why some cabins were colder than the outside under specific conditions. Warm air escaping at the top and cold air entering at the bottom creates a circulation that reverses the logic of shelter. Instead of sheltering people from weather, the cabin channeled the weather through itself. This is where indigenous methods began to appear in marginally improved settler structures, often as fragments without full context. A settler would see a bark-covered shelter and copy the outer form while missing the crucial interior logic, the small central hearth chamber, the vestibule that traps wind, the layered insulating skins, the floor depressions that hold cold air away from sleeping benches. If this kind of frontier survival knowledge speaks to you, consider subscribing for more frontier engineering stories. Beyond design, there was a social element to these failures. Pride, haste, and the prideful independence prized on the frontier led many to reject advice. A man who could fell and raise a cabin in a week might not see value in sitting with an indigenous elder to learn wind patterns and microclimate. Yet the elders had cumulative testing behind their methods, decades if not generations of observation. Their shelters were not born of superstition, but of repeated measurement. Which side of the slope warmed first in late autumn, where the wind never failed? At what pitch snow sloughed cleanly? Quantitatively, the penalties were unvarnished. A single unprotected windward doorway could increase hourly heat loss by the equivalent of 1.53 kilos of seasoned wood per hour under sustained downslope wind conditions. An overlarge single room might demand an extra $45–90 kilograms of wood per day to maintain a 10 to 15 degree higher interior temperature. These were not theoretical sums. They were the difference between waking with heat in your limbs and waking with ice in your clothes. And so, the frontier cabin, often conceived as a simple answer to the elemental problem of cold, revealed itself as a complex machine. Its failures were not random. They were engineering errors with predictable outcomes, and each error left a traceable signature in frost lines, soot patterns, and the stories left behind around later campfires. They say wood keeps out the cold, but I learned it was the door and the angle that decided if wood would ever be enough. When Jonas finally understood that his cabin was working against him, not for him, he sought out what other men, especially the ones who had survived more than a few Rockies winters, were doing differently, and what he found overturned nearly everything he believed about shelter. The strongest cabins in the high country were not the biggest, nor the prettiest, nor the ones built to impress passing trappers. The warmest cabins were the ones that looked almost unimpressive, smaller, narrower, quieter. They were built with a kind of elegant logic that came directly from understanding how heat behaves, how cold gathers, and how wind chooses its targets. The first thing Jonas noticed in those successful cabins was volume. They were compact, deliberately so. Old mountain hands and indigenous families alike built their winter structures with the principle that the smaller the airspace, the easier it is to heat. A cabin just wide enough for a bed, a stove, and a short bench could warm from freezing to livable in less than an hour using a modest fire. Air in a small chamber rises, circulates, and retains warmth more readily. The fire's energy goes into heating people, not empty space. Some cabins even had an inner core room, a second wall inside the first, creating a warm box within the larger structure. The outer room acted as a buffer zone, catching cold before it reached the living space. The inner sleeping chamber held heat so well that frost never formed on the interior logs. When storms raged outside, that room stayed 20 to 30 degrees warmer than its surroundings. Dawes explained it simply. A man lives in the small place. The big place is for the cold to get lost in. Next came orientation, the art of turning the structure away from the wind. Jonas remembered his own east-facing door and winced. Men who lasted more than one winter in the Rockies placed their doors on the south or southeast sides, protected by a small angled wall or lean-to that acted as a natural wind block. This porch wall, sometimes just 3 or 4 feet of logs, broke the wind's first strike. With no direct wind pressure on the door, warm air was no longer sucked out and cold air no longer poured in. Then Jonas noticed the cold sink. In several indigenous winter lodges and a few well-designed settler cabins, builders had intentionally created a shallow pit, sometimes just 6 to 10 inches lower than the main floor, right near the entryway. This depression was where the densest, cold air settled. Anyone inside stayed on the slightly raised platform above that cold layer. The stove heated the upper air, and the cold basin stayed contained, preventing drafts from crawling across bedding, creeping into corners. Without the cold sink, Jonas realized his own floor had become a wind highway. He studied roof angles next. The best cabins carried a steep, pitched roof, 40 to 50 degrees. This angle allowed snow to slide off regularly rather than cling and crush. The pitch also helped warm interior air collect to the top and recirculate, instead of trapping cold layers against the rafters. Many indigenous winter lodges used conical or sharply angled forms for the same reason. Snow sheds, smoke escapes cleanly, and the structure breathes. The walls shocked him most. Unlike the uniform peeled logs he'd carefully stripped smooth, effective cabins used irregular natural profile logs, thicker on one end, slightly curved, sometimes still holding bits of bark or texture. These imperfections interlocked. They created friction in ledges for chinking to cling to. Moss or clay stayed put. The wind met not a straight, uninterrupted seam, but a maze of surfaces that slowed it. Jonas ran his hand along one such wall and realized why his own seams had whistled. Smooth logs were tidy to the eye, but treacherous against the wind. Inside these cabins, the air felt different. Warmer, yes, but also gentler. Less movement, fewer micro-drafts. The fire didn't roar just to maintain a baseline. Instead, a small, steady burn sufficed. Jonas could stand near the door and not feel a blade of cold across his ankles. Light from the fire warmed the room evenly, tinting the logs amber. The moment that truly changed him came when an older Métis hunter showed him the door shield technique. A simple slab of wood hung behind the door on pegs, forming a tight-fitting panel that dropped when the door closed. It sealed drafts instantly. Combined with a door set leeward of prevailing winds, the difference was astonishing. A settlement might burn through a cord of wood each week, while a properly shielded cabin of the same size used half that amount. Jonas couldn't help imagining how his own nights might have gone if he'd understood even one of these principles before winter hit. He returned home with a notebook full of sketches. There, he cut an inner room into his own structure, hanging a thick curtain of hides across its entry to trap heat. He built an L-shaped wind wall outside his door. He deepened the threshold into a genuine cold sink. He added a steep, snow-shedding shield to the roof's upwind side. He chinked the walls again with layered moss and packed them firmly. And as the first trial of his repaired cabin came, another night of driving wind and plunging cold, Jonas sat inside his small inner room, feeling the miracle of still air. The fire, for once, worked with the cabin instead of against it. Warmth held, cold stayed outside. The cabin finally behaved like a machine properly tuned. The lesson struck him with quiet force. A shelter isn't four walls. A shelter is physics arranged to your advantage. He closed his eyes, listening to the calm within the storm, and felt a kind of peace for the first time that winter. They didn't need more firewood. They needed less air leaking to the wrong places. Jonas had rebuilt his cabin based on what he'd learned. But it wasn't until the coldest stretch of that winter that he finally saw the full power of the changes. Not his ideas, but his hard numbers. For the first time, he could measure the difference between a structure that obeyed mountain physics and one that defied it. It began on a morning when the valley lay under a pale gray skeezai. Frost coated every surface in delicate crystalline feathers. The temperature outside hovered near -30 degrees. It was the kind of cold that made wood ring when tapped, the kind that sank into the deepest cracks of logs. While the wind rested for a moment, Jonas stepped outside and stood between two cabins, his own, now tightened and reoriented, and the old structure used by a pair of trappers down the ridge, one built in the classic wrong layout. The difference was immediately visible. A faint plume of warm air eased gently out of Jonas's chimney, rising slow and straight. But from the other cabin, hot air streamed from the roofline. Without a proper draft, that heat was escaping along the eaves instead of the flue. Even without instruments, Jonas could see energy bleeding away. Later that day, he decided to take a closer look. Using simple tools, ice on a metal pan to track melting rates, a strip of animal gut stretched tight to measure drafts, A pocket thermometer. Jonas began to gather data the way any frontier man could have. The results shocked him. Inside the poorly built cabin, after an hour of burning through a full armload of wood, the interior temperature barely climbed above -5 degrees. Worse still, a constant draft slid along the floor at 2 to 3 miles per hour. Jonas could feel it as a creeping line of cold across his boots. Up near the rafters, the warm air gathered, forming a layer that the occupants could never reach. He moved his instruments to the repaired cabin. With the same amount of wood and the same fire size, the interior rose quickly, 20 degrees, 25, then 35. At one point he saw the thermometer rise above 40 inside the small inner room, a swing of nearly 80 degrees from outdoors. It wasn't magic, it wasn't luck, it was engineering. The cold sink he dug near the entry trapped the densest air. The door shield eliminated the constant siphoning pressure. The inner chamber kept the volumes tight. The logs, now irregular and properly chinked, reduced drafts from a steady stream to a soft whisper. Jonas repeated the tests at night, when downslope winds turned vicious. In the old cabin the wind pressed against the east-facing wall, surging through every seam. Warm air shot upward and outward, while cold scrubbed the floor. Even with the stove blazing loud, the interior temperature dropped back towards 0. He didn't need sophisticated instruments to see the truth. He set a shallow pan of snow on the floor inside the drafty structure. Minutes later, he watched it begin to sublimate. The cold air actually flowed over the snow and carried particles with it. In his own cabin, he did the same test. The snow barely moved. The air was still. Next, he measured the roof performance. A shallow-pitched roof on the bad cabin held a thick slab of compressed snow. Beneath it, the interior rafters sweated condensation, then froze, producing icy stalactites. The weight overhead increased every hour. Any shift in rain, a heavier snowbelt, could have collapsed it. The roof was not merely inefficient, it was dangerous. By contrast, the steep 45-degree roof Jonas installed shed snow continuously. Even during heavy snowfall, little built up, and the beams stayed dry on the inner side. A dry roof is an insulated roof. A heavy, wet roof is a cold sponge. He moved outside to compare external heat signatures. Light smoke drifting from his chimney contrasted with the thick plume spilling from the other cabin's eaves. Where his chimney pulled clean upward, the drafty cabin leaked heat from every joint, every misaligned log, every poorly fit seam. To test airflow, Jonas tied a thin ribbon of deer gut and held it near each structure. In the poorly designed cabin, the ribbon quivered violently along the doorframe. At one point it snapped sideways as if yanked. The pressure differential had created a tiny wind tunnel. In his own improved cabin, the ribbon barely stirred unless he placed it directly in front of the flue. He began recording numbers in neat charcoal markings inside his notebook. Bad cabin interior, -5 to 10 degrees during storms. His optimized cabin interior, 20 to 35 degrees. Draft speed inside bad cabin, for her of 4 to 8 miles per hour in floor-level currents. Draft speed inside optimized cabin, less than 1 mile per hour. Snow load risk, high on shallow roof, negligible on steep roof. These figures weren't abstractions, they were survival margins. A body exposed to -5 degrees indoors is fighting a constant thermal assault. Fingers numb, breath crystallizes, wood consumption skyrockets. Sleep is a battle. A trapped settler might burn 60 to 80 pounds of wood each night just to stay conscious, but in a cabin holding 30 degrees inside, the same man could sleep with 1 blanket. Firewood could be rationed. Tools stayed pliable. Water didn't freeze in the pot. The structure itself helped him stay alive. It wasn't lost on Jonas that these were the same conditions in As Jonas finished his cold season experiment, a storm came tearing over the ridge, blowing sheets of snow sideways. The old cabin shuddered. Jonas felt the door buck inward as he stood outside. Snow curled under the sill, swept by the pressure. He could hear loose shingles rasping against each other. Then he stepped into his own rebuilt cabin. Silence. Pressure equalized. The wind didn't punish the structure. It flowed around it. He sat down beside the stove and felt a pocket of still, warm air settle around him. He barely needed to add more wood. The cabin held heat the way a good pack holds scent, naturally, without struggle. He wrote a final number in his notebook. Energy saved, roughly 50%, and beneath it. More fire isn't the answer. Better design is. The thermal camera doesn't lie. Even 40 degrees of winter give way when the cabin is built right. Long before Jonas ever set an axe to timber, before trappers and settlers began scattering cabins across the mountains, the people who lived in the high valleys already understood the physics of winter, not through equations or diagrams, but through experience refined across centuries of storms. They learned to read wind the way other people read animal tracks. They knew how snow behaved on different slopes. They knew the difference between a cold that took your breath and a cold that merely watched you. And their shelters, whether winter lodges, mat-lined structures, bark-covered frameworks, or insulated pit houses, were built from this deep, accumulated knowledge. Jonas encountered the full weight of that understanding when he met a Shoshone family camped in a sheltered bend of the valley. Their winter lodge was not impressive in size. Its frame was modest, its covering a layered skin of bark, woven mats, hides, and insulating padding. Smoke rose in a thin, controlled column through a small vent that could be adjusted with surprising precision. There were no bright seams, no places where wind carved through. Every part of the structure seemed to know its job. Inside, the air shifted gently but stayed warm. Heat from the small central hearth collected under the draped coverings and radiated evenly. The sleeping benches, raised just a few handspans above the floor, sat in the perfect band of warm air. Below them, the cold pool rested harmlessly in the depressed center pit. The lodge kept warmth not by overpowering winter, but by cooperating with the ways cold and heat naturally want to move. Jonas sat there for the first time, and realized he had never truly been in a designed winter shelter before. His own cabin, any settler cabin really, felt suddenly crude by comparison. He had hammered and stacked and forced wood into a shape he liked, but these people had built something that listened. One of the elders, a woman with silver-threaded braids and a steady gaze, explained some of the principles behind their construction. She spoke not in technical terms, but in the language of weather and habit. "Wind has a path it likes," she said. "You don't stand in its path, you turn aside and let it pass." She traced a line in the air, showing how their lodge door faced the sheltered crease of the slope. "Cold falls," she added, "so you give it a place to collect." She pointed to the shallow pit where the densest air settled harmlessly away from the people. Everything that had seemed mysterious to Jonas now made perfect sense when viewed through these principles. Their structure had direction, like a creature with a front and back. It had breathing, with its smoke vent and draft hole forming a controlled circulation. And it had weight distribution, with its rounded form shedding snow instead of holding it. Some cabins built by trappers and settlers borrowed the shape of indigenous shelters but missed the invisible logic. They copied the outline but misplaced the door. They built a cold sink but filled it with storage crates. They layered bark but used smooth pine that warped in freeze-thaw cycles. They forgot, or never learned, that every feature existed because the cold had tested it. Jonas listened as the elder described how generations had slowly, patiently improved their shelters. When they saw snow sliding too quickly down the slope onto the doorway, they built side screens to divert it. When smoke backed into the living space, they adjusted vent heights or changed the inner lining. When long, cold spells drained heat, they narrowed the central space. Every change came from observing the mountains over lifetimes. "Nothing here is to look good," she told Jonas, gesturing at her lodge. "It is to live." As he walked around the structure later, he noticed how the exterior materials created layers, each one catching a different part of the weather. The outer bark deflected wind and shed wet snow. Under that, a woven mat layer slowed drafts. Beneath that, hides trapped warmth. And inside all of it, the compact living space needed only a small flame to bring the temperature up to comfort. The lesson was not that settlers needed to copy indigenous shelters exactly. Jonas's improved cabin was still a cabin. The lesson was that principles matter more than appearances: orientation, volume, airflow, layering, windbreaking, controlled escape, protected entry, cold management. These principles were not singular inventions. They were the result of countless seasons spent paying attention. Jonas realized why so many settlers had failed. They tried to build fortresses of wood rather than partners to the land. They fought the cold instead of shaping its path. They feared the wind instead of diverting it. And above all, they dismissed the knowledge of the people who already understood how winter worked. As another storm approached, a long sweeping wall of gray moving down the valley, the Shoshone family prepared their lodge with calm efficiency. A few handfuls of fresh insulating moss, a quick tightening of the vent frame, a small shift of their windscreen to catch the developing gusts. No panic, no scramble for more firewood. The lodge was ready because it had been ready for generations. Jonas stepped back into the lodge just as the wind arrived. Outside, the storm hammered the land, tearing at tree limbs and filling the air with swirling white. Inside, the temperature barely changed. A soft, steady warmth breathed around him. A flicker of firelight warmed the woven walls. No drafts, no shuddering timbers, no fear. He closed his eyes and listened to the storm howl, and in that moment, he knew he was witnessing a form of engineering far older than nails or cut lumber. This was engineering shaped by necessity, refined by wisdom, proven by survival. A shelter is not to fight the cold, she said. It is to guide it away. This wasn't. Look, this was engineering tested by generations. By late winter, Jonas no longer saw his rebuilt shelter as a stack of timber. He saw it as a machine, one with inputs, pathways, and outcomes. Every part of it served a purpose. Every log, every angle, every seam shaped the behavior of heat, cold, and wind. A cabin was not a box. It was a device for directing invisible forces. Before his transformation, Jonas had believed in muscle. If a cabin grew cold, he worked harder. If the wind rose, he braced beams. If the fire waned, he fed it. His answer to winter was more effort, but winter didn't care about effort. Winter cared only about physics. In the mountains, where storms dug their claws deep and cold pooled overnight like water in a trough, the difference between surviving and failing depended entirely on whether a man understood the machinery of shelter. As the season's harshest storm approached, a wall of iron-gray cloud rolling across the sky, Jonas prepared an experiment he'd been thinking about for weeks. He wanted to test two cabins side by side under identical conditions, one built with the common mistakes of settlers, and another optimized according to the principles he had gathered from indigenous knowledge, experienced trappers, and the raw numbers he had measured. The first cabin, the old style, stood exactly as many frontier men would have built it. A single room, square footprint, east-facing door, shallow roof, smooth logs, poorly arranged chinking, and a large open interior with no secondary wall. The second cabin stood 30 yards away, modest and compact, with a steep roof, irregular logs, a cold sink at the entrance, an inner chamber, and a porch wall shielding the door from the prevailing winds. Jonas had rebuilt sections of his own cabin to match these improvements. Now he wanted to watch the two designs battle the same storm. As the leading edge of the tempest swept through the valley, snow dust rose from the ground in sheets. The wind struck the old cabin first. Jonas watched from a distance as gust after gust hammered the east-facing door. Snow curled under the threshold, riding a draft that had carved a channel through the floor. Higher up, smoke leaked from between the logs instead of rising through the chimney. Already the roof shingles trembled. He stepped into the old cabin with his thermometer. Inside, despite a roaring fire, the air felt strained, thin, unsettled, restless. The stove heat gathered near the ceiling, creating a stifling band while the floor-level air stayed deadly cold. The thermometer told the story. A weak climb, barely reaching 10 degrees above freezing. Jonas crouched and felt the draft sweeping across his shins. You didn't need numbers to understand it. The cabin felt like a lung breathing the wrong direction. He stepped outside, crossing through the storm to the optimized cabin. Immediately, the wind behavior changed. Instead of slamming directly into the door, the storm broke against the angled porch wall. Wind pressed, upward and away, flowing around the structure's sides. Snow hit the steep roof, slipped, and fell. Inside, Jonas struck a match and the fire caught easily. The temperature rose in minutes, 15 degrees, then 25, then over 30. The air felt calm, not stagnant, controlled. It felt like the shelter itself was smoothing the storm into something manageable. He measured drafts using a thin strip of gut. In the old cabin, the strip had whipped sideways violently, tugged by invisible currents. In the optimized cabin, it fluttered only when Jonas moved it deliberately. Even at the floor level, right where cold should dominate, the air hardly shifted at all. The cold sink held it calmly. He set a pot of water in each cabin. In the old structure, it cooled rapidly, its surface dimpling as drafts grazed it. In the engineered cabin, the water steamed for nearly an hour, barely disturbed by the storm outside. The difference was elemental. One cabin consumed energy, the other preserved it. Later, Jonas stepped back into the storm to examine both roofs. The old cabin's shallow angle had caught 3 inches of wind-packed snow in just an hour. More weight meant more pressure, more cold conduction, more danger. The new cabin's roof shed almost everything. Key-beams stayed warm to the touch. The more Jonas observed, the clearer the metaphor grew. A cabin behaves the way you train it to behave. Treat it like a rigid box, and it resists nothing well. Treat it like a system that channels airflow, controls temperature layers, and manages moisture, and it becomes a partner in survival. That night, the storm intensified. Gusts slapped against the valley walls, and the sky filled with icy particulate that stung skin like needles. Jonas checked on the old cabin again. He wasn't inside more than a minute before frost formed on his beard. The fire raged in the stove, but the heat rose uselessly toward the ceiling. Soot danced along the rafters as draft pulled upwards unpredictably. Jonas imagined settlers trying to sleep in such conditions, blankets freezing, breath turning brittle, hands numb even by the fire. Returning to the optimized cabin was like crossing into another world. The heat layered properly, warmth near the beds, cooler air near the floor, the cold sink holding what it should. Jonas found himself removing his gloves and coat within minutes. The storm howled, yet the cabin's interior stayed quiet, steady, dependable. He sat near the inner room, feeling the fire's warmth press outward instead of leaking away. This was the moment he understood the truth that had eluded so many frontier men before him. Strength was not the same as thickness, and warmth was not the same as wood. Survival came from directing the cold, not overpowering it. As dawn approached, the storm broke. Light filtered through the valley, turning snowdrifts of bruised blue. Jonas stepped out into the untouched calm. He looked back at both cabins. Contrast unmistakable. One was a battered shell, already bearing the scars of a single night. The other stood clean and mostly untroubled. The lessons of winter formed themselves plainly in his mind. A cabin is a machine. It must be built as one. If you do not shape the wind will shape you. The optimized cabin didn't just survive, it breathed the cold out the right way. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year. The storms grew shorter, the mornings a little less sharp, and the sunlight began to stay longer on the cabin walls. Jonas, stepping out into the valley after that final trial, felt something he hadn't felt all season. Confidence. Not arrogance, not bravado, but the quiet assurance that comes from understanding the land rather than wrestling blindly against it. He stood on the ridge above his cabin and looked down at the two structures he had tested. The old-style cabin, battered and half-choked with roof-heavy snow, leaned slightly under the pressure of the season. Frost scars streaked the interior walls. The logs had warped from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. It was a shelter in the same way a bucket with holes is a container, only in shape, not in function. And then there was the optimized cabin. Snow had shed from the roof cleanly. The porch wall stood firm. Smoke drifted gently from the correct vent point. The entry remained clear, the wind diverted, the structure tight and composed. It looked like a living thing, something that had endured the winter with intention. Jonas walked slowly toward it, remembering every lesson that had brought him to this moment. He thought of the Shoshone lodge that had taught him humility. He thought of the trappers who had shown him the value of small volume and inner rooms. He thought of the way wind moved like water, shaping everything it touched. He thought of the thermal numbers in his charcoal notebook, the stark differences between cabins separated by only a few choices. Those lessons did not belong to one man or one culture. They were truths of the land itself. And Jonas understood now that the old mistakes weren't failures of intelligence, they were failures of listening. As the winter finally eased, settlers in the region began preparing to rebuild or renovate their cabins. Jonas quietly helped several of them make changes, not by lecturing, not by boasting, but by showing, by demonstrating how small adjustments made huge differences. A man whose cabin always filled with smoke learned to raise and shape his vent. A family whose bedroom froze every night installed a simple interior curtain that created a warm pocket of air. A hunter who had lost livestock in a blizzard rebuilt his entry to face away from the prevailing wind. Each change carried the same principle. Understand what winter wants to do and build a structure that guides it elsewhere. Jonas found himself repeating the same sentence again and again. A cabin is a machine, not a monument. Some listened immediately. Others dismissed the advice until the next storm reminded them. But over time, the valley changed. More cabins adopted steep roofs, more added windbreaks, more carved cold sinks by the threshold. More understood the necessity of an inner space, smaller, tighter, more efficient. The settlers who learned these lessons early survived with less strain, less wood, less fear. The ones who resisted often found themselves working twice as hard for half the warmth. Jonas had lived on both sides of that divide. He knew which one he'd choose forever. The legacy of these principles stretched beyond that valley. As mountain men traveled, traded, shared stories around campfires, fragments of indigenous engineering and winter shelter logic spread with them. Some adopted the ideas fully, some adopted them halfway. But the frontier began to shift, bit by bit, toward a deeper respect for environmental design. Modern off-grid cabins, even those built more than a century later, still repeated early mistakes. Doors placed on the wrong wall, oversized interior rooms, shallow roofs that looked idyllic until the first wet snowfall crushed them, smooth log walls that leaked heat like sieves. Jonas saw versions of his old self everywhere, people relying on determination instead of design. When he encountered these cabins, he understood their builders. He had been one of them, but he also felt an urge to pass on the truth he had nearly frozen beneath. Survival is not an act of strength, it is an act of alignment, aligning with terrain, with physics, with lessons written into the land. The final days of winter were quiet. Jonas sat on the step of his optimized cabin, listening to the slow drip of meltwater from the eaves. The air carried the smell of warming pine. The valley, once a deep basin of punishing cold, felt almost forgiving. He looked at the doorway, at the porch wall, at the roof angling sharply toward the sky. He looked at the small inner room glowing with steady warmth. He looked at the cold sink carved into the threshold. He thought of every storm he had survived this winter, and every storm he would survive in the years to come. The mountains had not softened. He had simply learned to build in a way that respected them. As the sun dipped low, turning the snowfields golden, Jonas breathed a slow, patient breath and whispered the lesson that would carry into every future season. Survival comes from design, not bravery. It was a truth that settlers rarely said aloud, but that indigenous builders had known for generations. A truth carved not into books, but into the shape of every shelter that stayed warm when the world outside turned hostile. And as the wily settled into dusk, Jonas packed away his notebook, knowing that the machine he had built, the machine that had saved his life, was not a product of luck or strength. It was the result of listening. When the storms return, it's always the design that decides who walks out. If stories of real frontier survival speak to you, consider subscribing for more.